Hey, Beniamin, Tommy Gibbons here, professor of the course. Welcome. Great to have you. And thanks for the good work you've done here in week one in both response forums. Appreciate the kind of critical engagement here with Witherington and Johnson. Trying to take what they're saying seriously, but then asking the critical questions, making your own proposals. Love it. That's exactly what we're after. So well done on that front. And I have to say, I tend to agree with you that uh, commentators sometimes assume that a thesis statement like Paul's couldn't have a sort of poetic flourish to it, um, that it can be layered, that to understand what it means might not be about sort of parsing things down to really find distinctions per se, but could be instead trying to sort of track with the force of it, especially as it reverberates across the development of the letter. And I think you kind of do that with your own interpretation, just kind of trying to coordinate what Paul might be saying in the thesis with the actual content of the argument that fills the rest of the letter. I think that's a great approach to interpreting pregnant phrases like what we find in the thesis of the letter, and really doing that sort of thing throughout. Often, the theological tradition that has grown up around and through the language of Paul's is so, full of possibilities and suggestive kinds of associations that um, people don't take the time to just try to track with the thread of the argument and see how that might help us to focus the possibilities of that kind of robust theological tradition so that we're kind of following the contours of Paul's argument. And in that sense, I think that I also want to understand the phrase that Paul lifts from Habakkuk very broadly, um, as opposed to being something super technical. And of course, I think faith is really a key term that Paul wants to develop throughout the letter. And so it has um, great significance in the context of Habakkuk that I think Paul wants to build on. And that's where taking the particulars of the prophetic book of Habakkuk into account can help us, I think, kind of understand better how Paul is drawing from it. It's a faith that is manifest in these horrifying conditions that the prophet is complaining to God about, and yet the word of the Lord comes to the prophet to tell him that despite everything that he is seeing and complaining about, God does remain trustworthy, faithworthy, you might say, faithful. That in that sense, the way of the just through the crisis that Habakkuk is decrying is to trust God's provision, to trust the coming of God's justice. And that's, I think, expressed very practically in that it is not giving in to the temptations of arrogance or cynicism or pride, where um, people would exploit the vulnerability of others, cave to a mentality of just dog eat dog. Trusting God means being generous with other people in times of acute vulnerability and need, where it's easy to take advantage of other people. But the just by faith will live, Paul says. So, or Habakkuk says. Then I think Paul's building on that because what he's about to go into in Romans is the temptation amidst all of the injustice of the human, not the least of which is that of the empire. It is tempting to pose as judges of one another, to be judgmental in the way that people treat each other. And this, Paul says, God has ruled out by exposing the injustice of all of the human. And therefore, opening the way for people to relate to one another as the way of faith, a way that trusts God to be the judge, to rule. And this is, of course, manifest finally in the way Jesus himself has lived as faith embodied. So that's kind of how I'd want to pull those together, Habakkuk and Romans. And this is going to play out in the rest of Romans, as I think you're anticipating, in all kinds of concrete, sort of pastoral, communal difficulties. Um, how to relate to enemies within the people of God that are hostile to the audience, how to negotiate, the differences of the community, to learn to respect what different people bring to the table, as it were, and not to allow their sort of pursuit of Jesus as Lord to lead them to usurp God's authority in the way that the empire will be exposed and even brought down eventually by the justice of God, to leave room, Paul says, for God's wrath, to protect their own conscience instead of becoming like the Roman enemies that they are opposing with the way that they're living. And then, of course, life around the table, Romans 14 and 15, how to share a common life, a common table, share goods, share time. These are the kinds of challenges in which faith is taking shape. So that's what I think we can anticipate from the thesis of the letter. Um, Love that you like Talbus. I love that stuff. The tone of his lectures is always kind of, I don't know, delightful to me. And I think that he brings out sort of key uh, dimensions of the force of Paul's letter that the predominant Christian tradition has tended to neglect. So I hope that's going to be inspiring for us. Thanks again, Beniamin, for some great work here in the first week in both discussions. And if you want to reply to this video, of course you can, but no pressure to do that. But if you'll at least, uh, write received or something like that, so that I know that you got the video and it came through okay, you're able to view it. That'd be great. Looking forward to more conversation with you. Welcome again to the course.